Today, we're featuring the most horrifying pet attacks on their owners, from a retired army medic who decided to demonstrate his bond with a jaguar by entering her enclosure, to a contractor who swam with a Burmese python in front of guests.
It was March 6, 2018, and late summer heat lingered in Pretoria as 15 guests gathered at Francois du Toit's property for a barbecue. The 42-year-old wildlife volunteer had built his identity around dangerous animals, a passion that began in childhood during safari expeditions across Kruger National Park. Francois thrived on admiration and attention. Friends described him as charismatic but reckless, someone who constantly pushed boundaries to impress others. What started as conservation work had transformed into something darker, a need to prove his dominance over nature's most feared predators. 2 decades of working with rejected animals had given Francois dangerous confidence. He believed he possessed some mystical connection with the wild creatures, often telling visitors that animals could sense his pure intentions. This delusion had been reinforced by years of successful interactions, creating a feedback loop that would prove fatal. His pride and joy was Napoleon, a magnificent male lion he'd raised by hand after the cub was rejected by its mother. The custom-built enclosure dominated his property's eastern section, measuring 60 by 40 feet with steel fencing over 12 feet high. Inside, Napoleon paced with fluid grace, his golden mane rippling as 420 pounds of pure predatory muscle moved with deceptive calm. African lions represent nature's most efficient killing machines. They can sprint up to 35 miles per hour, leap more than 12 feet horizontally, and generate bite forces exceeding 650 pounds per square inch. Even captive-raised lions retain fundamental predatory instincts that no amount of human contact can eliminate. As twilight painted the sky, Francois retrieved a bucket of fresh raw meat from his shed. His guests formed a semicircle around the fence, pulling out smartphones in anticipation of another feeding demonstration. The wine consumed during dinner had made Francois more boastful than usual. He stepped into the buffer area, then unlocked the inner gate, entering Napoleon's territory directly. The attack was sudden and devastating. Napoleon launched himself forward with explosive power, both front paws striking Francois simultaneously in the chest and shoulders. Before he could process what was happening, Napoleon's massive jaws clamped around his neck with surgical precision, the 4-inch canine teeth penetrating deep into soft tissue. The sound of crushing vertebrae was audible to horrified guests. Francois' cervical spine snapped like dry kindling under immense pressure. Blood erupted from puncture wounds, spraying across the dirt in arterial spurts. Napoleon's predatory instincts took complete control as he shifted his grip to Francois' left trap muscle and upper chest. The lion's powerful neck muscles contracted as he began the characteristic head-shaking motion that big cats use to tear flesh from bone. Deep lacerations opened across the shoulder and collarbone, exposing white bone beneath mangled tissue. Guests erupted into screams while someone frantically dialed emergency services. Napoleon repositioned over Francois' prone arm, his massive weight pinning the torso to the ground. The lion's jaws found purchase around the lower jaw and left side of the face, the crushing bite force pulverizing bone and cartilage. With a violent upward jerk, Napoleon tore away tissue from neck to cheekbone. Gripping the body by the torso, Napoleon began dragging his victim toward the far corner, away from screaming witnesses. Once reaching his preferred feeding spot, Napoleon settled down and began feeding methodically. Police arrived with sirens wailing as Napoleon lay contentedly beside Francois' partially consumed remains, blood matting his golden mane. A veterinarian from Johannesburg Zoo arrived with a tranquilizer rifle, but only after Napoleon collapsed unconscious could emergency personnel recover what remained of Francois du Toit. It was October 18, 2016. and the mist hung low over the wooded hills near Broken Bow, Oklahoma. Deep within the sprawling property owned by the Dunn family, a converted barn stall held the secret that would soon turn deadly. Inside, a 300-pound Bengal tiger named Rozzy paced behind makeshift barriers, watching every move of the young man who had raised him. While other teenagers in rural Oklahoma spent their Friday nights at football games and weekend bonfires, 21-year-old Caleb Dunn immersed himself in the shadowy world of exotic animal ownership. He spent countless hours watching big cat rescue videos and following illegal exotic pet forums, fascinated by people who claimed to have formed bonds with apex predators that defied conventional wisdom. When Caleb turned 18, a modest inheritance from family land sales provided him with the means to pursue his dangerous obsession. He contacted an unlicensed breeder in Texas who promised him a docile, hand-fed Bengal tiger cub that would be perfect for bonding. The seller assured Caleb that the animal would remain manageable and affectionate if raised properly from infancy. However, Caleb failed to understand the fundamental nature of the predator he was purchasing. Bengal tigers are among the strongest big cats, with males weighing over 500 pounds and capable of taking down much larger prey. Their 4-inch claws and 1,000 psi bite can crush bone with ease. Crucially, even hand-raised tigers retain their instincts, and may be more dangerous due to their lack of fear of humans. Caleb named the cub Rozzy and hid him in a converted stall at the edge of his grandparents' barn. Only 2 friends knew, sworn to secrecy, as Caleb shared plans to start a donation-based roadside attraction like ones he'd studied in rural Alabama and Missouri. His grandparents, both in their 70s, believed he was raising goats and had no idea a tiger was living in their barn. But tigers don't remain cubs forever, and by fall 2016, Rozzy had transformed into a magnificent and terrifying predator. At over 300 pounds, he had grown restless and powerful, his muscular frame barely contained by the makeshift enclosure Caleb had constructed from scavenged materials. The stall was reinforced with a patchwork of old fencing, kennel panels, and plywood. The enclosure's deadly flaw was its primitive security system, a chain-locked outer gate and a wooden inner divider that Caleb had to manually lift and secure each time he entered. This design required him to be inside the tiger's space while manipulating the barrier, a risky method no professional facility would allow. On the morning of October 18th, Caleb entered the stall to refill Rozzy's water barrel, a task he had done many times before. The security camera he had recently installed to monitor the enclosure captured footage that would later serve as key evidence for investigators. As he lifted the inner gate to pass the water barrel through, he became distracted by his phone, apparently attempting to capture a photo of Rozzy. In his momentary lapse of attention, he forgot to drop the lock bolt back into place, leaving the barrier unsecured. Rozzy, with the intelligence and opportunism that have made tigers apex predators for millions of years, immediately recognized the opening. He slipped through the divide, effectively cornering Caleb inside the confined space of the stall. The attack was swift and decisive. Tigers are ambush predators, evolved to kill large prey quickly and efficiently to minimize their own risk of injury. Rozzy struck low and fast, knocking Caleb off balance with a single swipe that tore through his thigh. As Caleb hit the ground, the tiger clamped down on his neck, crushing his airway and severing critical blood vessels in seconds. His arms flailed briefly before going limp. In the wild, tigers typically kill by delivering a crushing bite to the throat or back of the neck, severing the spinal cord or crushing the windpipe. This technique, perfected over countless generations, ensures a quick kill that prevents the prey from fighting back or escaping. Hours later, Caleb's friend Tyler arrived for the afternoon feeding to an unsettling silence. The stall door was ajar, and inside he found Caleb's body partially buried in straw, torn by deep claw marks and massive trauma. Rozzy paced calmly inside, likely satisfied with the kill. Tyler immediately called 911. When authorities arrived after an hour, they found themselves facing a scenario that highlighted the dangerous reality of illegal exotic animal ownership. Wildlife officials tranquilized Rozzy and transported him to a legitimate sanctuary in Colorado, where staff described the tiger as well-fed but completely unsocialized, a dangerous combination that made him unsuitable for any form of human interaction. Caleb's grandparents, visibly shaken and devastated by the revelation of what had been happening on their property, insisted they had no knowledge of the tiger's presence. Caleb's funeral was held quietly in Broken Bow, attended by a small group of friends and family still reeling from the shock. His grandparents, overwhelmed with guilt and grief, chose not to speak publicly again about what happened. It was November 16, 2013, the Wyoming wind slicing across the plains near Cody, as a Barbary lion paced behind rusted bars in a half-acre of makeshift enclosures. Just past noon, Derek Pruitt stepped through the gate carrying a tray of raw venison, unaware that his years of reckless confidence were about to meet their violent end. Derek Pruitt was a 38-year-old former rodeo star whose fearless reputation on the bronc riding circuit had been built on calculated risks and split-second timing. When a career-ending injury forced his retirement, he channeled that same dangerous confidence into exotic animal ownership, converting old rodeo panels into enclosures on his property outside Cody. His centerpiece was Jax, a 500-pound Barbary lion he had acquired as a cub and raised to adulthood over 3 years. Barbary lions, extinct in the wild but still bred in captivity, are apex predators weighing up to 550 pounds, with 2-inch claws, a 650 psi bite, and hunting instincts that remain sharp even when hand-raised. As males mature, they grow more territorial, powerful, and dangerously unpredictable. Derek's approach to lion handling was built on dangerous misconceptions. His philosophy centered on dominance through calmness, believing that lions could sense human emotions and respond to confidence with submission. He regularly entered Jax's enclosure without protective barriers, hand-feeding the massive predator and walking the perimeter with nothing but a stick for protection. The warning signs had been mounting for weeks. Jax had been exhibiting classic stress behaviors, pacing at odd hours, refusing food for days, showing increased agitation during routine interactions. These behavioral changes are common in captive lions experiencing hormonal fluctuations or territorial stress, often preceding aggressive episodes. But Derek dismissed these red flags as winter laziness, his overconfidence blinding him to the danger signals that any trained animal behaviorist would have recognized immediately. On Thanksgiving weekend, his 14-year-old nephew Bryce had come by to help with feeding, as he often did. The enclosure's safety vestibule meant to protect direct contact was bypassed as always. Derek insisted Jax knew him too well to ever pose a threat. At 12:04 p.m., Derek entered the lion's pen carrying venison quarters. The lion lay still in the corner, watching. Derek called his usual greeting and turned his back to approach the feeding platform. That single act, turning away, was all it took. Without a sound, Jax rose and closed the distance in 2 strides. He struck with blinding speed, raking his forepaws across Derek's back and slamming him to the ground. Bryce screamed, frozen just outside the fence, as Jax clamped his jaws around Derek's neck and shook violently. The lion's bite, designed to crush windpipes and snap vertebrae, did exactly that. Derek kicked weakly for a few seconds, but Jax remained locked in, eyes fixed, unmoving. The animal's instincts had overtaken years of hand-rearing and familiarity. Bryce grabbed a metal rake and shouted, striking the bars. Jax didn't flinch. The 911 call came at 12:07 p.m. Bryce, voice shaking, told the dispatcher about the incident. When deputies arrived at 12:18, Jax was still hovering over Derek's mangled body. Officers fired a single shot, killing the lion instantly. Derek was pronounced dead on scene. His injuries matched a classic big cat takedown. crushed cervical vertebrae, deep claw marks across his spine, and puncture wounds through the throat. The untouched tray of venison nearby made one thing clear: Jax hadn't attacked for food. He had responded to instinct. Territorial, sudden, and final. A small funeral was held on the outskirts of Amarillo, attended by a few family members, 2 former rodeo friends, and a wildlife officer who had known Derek from inspection visits. There were no speeches, just silence, wind, and a closed casket. Bryce received trauma counseling, Derek's remaining animals were relocated, and the enclosure was dismantled within weeks. State officials quietly tightened exotic animal ownership regulations, closing the loopholes Derek had exploited. It was July 4th, 2015, and the backyard of Bobby Ray Jenkins' Florida home buzzed with the sounds of a traditional Independence Day celebration. The sprawling property in rural Polk County featured a large deck, multiple grills smoking with barbecue, and a custom-built concrete pool to house the most unusual party guest of all, Chomper, a 400-pound American alligator that Bobby Ray had been keeping illegally for over 8 years. 15 family members had gathered for the annual celebration, including children who had grown up watching their grandfather's dangerous relationship with the massive reptile. At 52, Bobby Ray was a retired auto mechanic who had spent his working years fixing engines and his retirement years collecting increasingly dangerous pets. His fascination with alligators had started when he found Chomper as a baby in a drainage ditch near his property. What began as a temporary rescue had evolved into an obsession, with Bobby Ray building an elaborate habitat and feeding system for the growing predator. He had ignored multiple warnings from Florida Fish and Wildlife officials. Bobby Ray's relationship with Chomper had become the stuff of local legend. He regularly hand-fed the massive alligator during family gatherings, treating the apex predator like an oversized pet dog. His grandchildren had grown up watching these feeding demonstrations, and Bobby Ray took pride in his ability to interact safely with one of nature's most dangerous predators. American alligators are apex predators that have remained virtually unchanged for over 200 million years, perfectly adapted for their role as ambush hunters in aquatic environments. Adult males can reach lengths of 14 feet and weights exceeding 1,000 pounds, with jaw muscles capable of exerting over 3,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. Their bite force is among the strongest in the animal kingdom, capable of crushing turtle shells and breaking the bones of larger mammals. Alligators are opportunistic feeders, driven entirely by instinct, and they view any movement near their territory as either a threat to be eliminated or prey to be consumed. That afternoon, Bobby Ray had been drinking beer and entertaining his family with stories of his adventures with Chomper. The alligator was floating motionlessly in his concrete pool, appearing docile and harmless in the Florida heat. As the barbecue progressed, several family members requested the traditional feeding demonstration that had become a highlight of their gatherings. Bobby Ray was happy to oblige, retrieving a whole chicken from his outdoor refrigerator. The 15 family members gathered around the pool's edge, with children sitting on their parents' shoulders to get a better view of the spectacle. Bobby Ray approached the pool's edge with the whole chicken dangling from his hand, calling out to Chomper in the playful tone he had used for years. As Bobby Ray leaned forward to drop the chicken into Chomper's waiting jaws, he lost his balance and fell partially into the pool. The moment his arm hit the water, Chomper's predatory instincts took over completely. The massive alligator's jaw snapped shut on Bobby Ray's extended arm with bone-crushing force, his 3,000 pounds of bite pressure instantly fracturing bones and severing major arteries. Chomper immediately began his signature death roll, spinning rapidly in the water while maintaining his grip on Bobby Ray's arm. The violent rotation dislocated Bobby Ray's shoulder and pulled him fully into the pool, where the alligator's natural advantage is became overwhelming. The family members screamed in horror as they watched Bobby Ray being dragged underwater, his blood turning the pool water crimson. The death roll continued for nearly a minute, each rotation causing additional trauma to Bobby Ray's arm and torso, while simultaneously disorienting him and filling his lungs with water. Chomper's powerful tail thrashed violently, striking Bobby Ray's body with enough force to crack ribs and cause internal bleeding. The alligator's grip never loosened, his teeth designed specifically for holding on to struggling prey. Bobby Ray's desperate attempts to break free only triggered Chomper's instincts to bite down harder and roll more aggressively. The massive alligator dragged his victim to the deeper end of the pool, where Bobby Ray's struggles grew weaker as blood loss and drowning combined to overwhelm his system. Within minutes, Bobby Ray's movement ceased, as the massive alligator's death roll proved unsurvivable. Chomper dragged Bobby Ray's lifeless body underwater, his instincts driving him to secure his kill in the depths of the pool. The traumatized family members, including young children, were forced to witness the entire gruesome spectacle. Emergency responders arrived within 18 minutes, but Chomper remained highly agitated and dangerous in the pool. It took wildlife officers over 90 minutes to safely tranquilize the massive alligator and recover what remained of Bobby Ray's body. The investigation revealed that Bobby Ray had been keeping the alligator illegally for years, ignoring multiple warnings from wildlife officials. Chomper was euthanized the following day, and Bobby Ray's death prompted stricter enforcement of exotic animal regulations in Florida. The traumatized family members required extensive counseling, and several of the children who witnessed the attack developed lasting psychological trauma. It was August 12, 2018, and the eastern Carpathian Mountains cast long shadows across the Popescu farm as the last day of the village harvest festival drew to a close. The air carried the sweet scent of ripening barley mixed with the earthy smell of ancient forests, a pastoral scene that would soon be shattered by primal violence. Lanel Popescu was shaped by the rhythms of rural Romanian life and a deep connection to the natural world. At 55, his weathered hands bore the calluses of someone who had spent decades working the soil. He was known throughout the region as someone with an almost mystical ability to connect with animals. Lanel's reputation as an animal whisperer had been built over decades of successful interactions with everything from injured wolves to abandoned fox cubs. Neighbors often brought him creatures they found in distress, and his success rate was legendary. This track record had given him dangerous confidence in his ability to tame even the most formidable predators. 8 years earlier, a female brown bear, weakened by a harsh winter and unable to care for her newborn cub, had been found dead near the village outskirts. The tiny cub, barely 3 weeks old and weighing less than 2 pounds, would have perished within hours without immediate intervention. When local authorities planned transport to a wildlife sanctuary, Lanel volunteered to provide temporary care. What began as a short-term rescue evolved into something permanent, as Lanel bottle-fed the cub every few hours, kept him warm, and gradually introduced solid foods as he grew stronger. The bear, whom Lanel named Ursu, simply bear in Romanian, thrived under his care and quickly became attracted to his human caretaker. As Ursu grew from a helpless cub into a powerful adult, Lanel constructed a specialized enclosure within his barn, measuring 20 by 30 feet with reinforced wooden walls topped by steel mesh. The space was designed with genuine care for the animal's comfort, complete with climbing structures, a small pool, and areas for both sun and shade. On this August afternoon, the Harvest Festival had drawn several local families to the farm for a traditional end-of-season celebration. Children ran through the barley fields while adults shared homemade tuica and discussed the year's crop yields. The highlight was always Linnell's demonstration with Ursu, an event that had become legendary throughout the region. Eurasian brown bears represent one of Europe's most formidable predator species, commanding both fear and respect from humans for millennia. Adult males can weigh over 600 pounds and stand nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, with curved claws up to 4 inches long and massive jaws designed for crushing and tearing. As the afternoon sun began to descend behind the Carpathian peaks, Linnell prepared for his demonstration. A group of 12 people gathered around the steel bars, including several children who pressed their faces against the mesh for a better view. Among the spectators were longtime neighbors, visiting relatives, and a few tourists who had heard about the famous tame bear. Linnell announced in his methodic Romanian dialect that Ursu was very special, explaining how he'd raised him from a tiny cub and that the bear knew he was family. He unlocked the heavy steel door, carrying a bucket filled with meat scraps, fish, and chunks of bread, the same routine they'd performed hundreds of times before. Linnell stepped confidently into the enclosure, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. Ursu approached slowly, his massive form moving with deceptive grace. At full size, the bear stood nearly as tall as Linnell when on his hind legs, and his bulk made the human appear almost childlike in comparison. But something was different this time. Perhaps it was the presence of many strangers, the unusual sounds and scents carried on the evening air, or some subtle change in Ursu's psychological state that had been building over months or years. Whatever triggered the bear's behavior, it deviated catastrophically from their established pattern. Without warning signs, no defensive posturing, no vocalizations, Ursu suddenly lunged forward with explosive power. His massive jaws opened to reveal 4-inch canine teeth, and he clamped down on Linnell's right shoulder with devastating force. The sound of breaking bones was clearly audible to horrified spectators. Linnell's confident expression vanished, replaced by shock and agony as Ursu's teeth penetrated through his heavy work shirt deep into the muscle and bone beneath. The bucket flew from his hands, scattering food across the concrete floor in a grotesque parody of their usual feeding ritual. Ursu's attack followed the typical pattern of brown bear aggression, a series of powerful bites and swipes designed to quickly incapacitate any threat. With Linnell's shoulders still locked in his jaws, the bear began shaking his massive head from side to side, tearing through muscle, tendons, and ligaments with horrifying efficiency. Spectators erupted into screams, while children were pulled away from the bars by panicked parents. Someone began shouting for help in Romanian, their voice cracking with panic and desperation as the peaceful harvest celebration transformed into a scene from humanity's darkest nightmares. Ursu released his grip only to immediately clamp down on the farmer's chest, his powerful jaws encompassing nearly the entire width of the torso. The bear's weight, over 650 pounds of muscle and bone, drove Linnell to the concrete floor with crushing force. The impact drove the air from his lungs and likely fractured several ribs even before Ursu's teeth found their mark. Blood began pooling beneath the body, spreading across the gray concrete in an ever-widening stain. Linnell's attempts to defend himself were pathetically inadequate against such overwhelming strength. His hands pushed weakly against the massive head, but it was like trying to move a mountain with bare fingers. George Popescu, Linnell's younger brother, grabbed a pitchfork and began striking the steel bars, creating a loud clanging sound in hopes of distracting the bear. He shouted desperately for Ursu to stop, to get away from his brother, his voice breaking with desperation and grief as he watched 8 years of trust and love dissolve into primal savagery. But Ursu was operating on pure predatory instinct now, his domesticated conditioning completely overwhelmed by millions of years of evolutionary programming. The bear stood on its hind legs to his full height, making him appear even more massive, then brought his full weight down on Linnell's prone form with bone-crushing impact. The farmer's ribs cracked audibly under the impact, and blood began flowing from his mouth as internal injuries mounted. Ursu's next bite targeted the abdomen, his powerful jaws clamping down below the rib cage, penetrating through skin and muscle into the abdominal cavity, causing massive internal trauma that no medical intervention could repair. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the evening air, as a neighbor who lived several kilometers away had heard the screaming carried by the mountain wind and called the local gendarmerie. 2 police vehicles raced up the winding dirt road, their sirens wailing across the peaceful countryside. Sergeant Alexandru Radu, a 25-year veteran, emerged with his service weapon drawn. He dealt with various wildlife incidents throughout his career, but nothing had prepared him for this scene. The sight of a mutilated body lying in a pool of blood while a massive bear paced nearby triggered his training in dealing with immediate threats to public safety. With no tranquilizer equipment available and Ursu showing continued signs of agitation, there was no time to wait for specialized wildlife authorities. The rifle shot that ended Ursu's life echoed across the Carpathian foothills, causing flocks of birds to rise from the surrounding forests in a dark cloud. The massive bear collapsed beside Linnell's body, his 8-year journey from orphaned cub to beloved pet to killer finally at an end. Paramedics arrived 20 minutes later, but their services were no longer needed. The coroner's examination revealed massive trauma to the chest and abdomen, multiple fractured ribs, a broken femur, and catastrophic blood loss that had drained the life from a man who believed love could conquer nature's most fundamental laws. It was April 2nd, 2014. The Nevada sun beat down on the dry outskirts of Pahrump, where prefab homes and rusted trailers lined the dirt roads. One of them was a faded blue trailer on Elmsworth Drive, home to Carla Edmonds, a 52-year-old former veterinary technician who locals quietly referred to as the Lion Lady. Carla was a woman who believed she understood predators in ways others couldn't. Her neighbors often heard her talking to the massive creature behind her trailer in the same gentle tones she might use with a house cat. She had raised Zorro, a male African lion, from an 8-week-old cub after purchasing him from an unlicensed breeder with money from her father's inheritance. For 6 years, she documented every moment of his growth, photos of him in her lap as a cub, videos of bottle feeding, countless images of his magnificent mane as he matured into a 400-pound apex predator. What Carla failed to fully comprehend was the fundamental nature of the animal she called her baby. African lions, even those raised in captivity, retain every instinct honed by millions of years of evolution. A male lion's bite force exceeds 650 pounds per square inch, enough to crush bone instantly. Their retractable claws, over 2 inches long, are designed to grip and tear flesh from struggling prey. Most critically, lions are hardwired to respond to blood scent and movement with predatory aggression, regardless of their relationship with humans. Carla housed Zorro in a 1,500 square foot enclosure behind her trailer, reinforced with steel fencing that met minimum legal requirements, but lacked the double barrier safety system used by legitimate sanctuaries. Neighbors had grown accustomed to seeing her enter and exit the enclosure without protective equipment, relying solely on what she believed was an unbreakable bond of trust. That belief would prove tragically fatal. On April 2nd, Carla had been distracted all morning, fielding phone calls about a potential donation to help with Zorro's care. She had skipped lunch, focusing instead on preparing his afternoon meal, raw beef ribs that she cut by hand in her cramped kitchen. While working, she had nicked her finger on the knife blade, a small cut that bled freely but seemed insignificant enough to ignore. That nick on her finger, combined with a bowl of blood-slick meat, was all it took to turn a hungry predator into a killer. Lions possess an extraordinary sense of smell, capable of detecting blood from considerable distances. The scent triggers a predatory instinct that overrides training and any bond with humans. As the afternoon heat intensified, Zorro had begun his familiar pacing pattern, a sign of growing agitation and hunger that Carla had witnessed countless times before, his eyes tracking every movement in his vision. Standard feeding protocol at any legitimate facility would have required Carla to use the feeding chute or divider gate to separate Zorro before entering his space. Instead, she grabbed the metal bowl of blood-scented meat in one hand and a towel in the other, then unlatched the main enclosure door and stepped directly into the lion's territory. The moment Carla crossed the threshold, Zorro's demeanor shifted with terrifying speed. His pacing stopped abruptly as he locked onto the scent of fresh blood emanating from both her injured finger and the raw meat. His pupils widened, muscles tensed, and tail flicked, a clear warning Carla missed or misread. The attack was swift and devastating, with part of it captured by a security camera mounted on the opposite wall. Zorro's 400-pound frame launched forward with explosive force, closing the distance in a single bound. The impact as he slammed Carla against the steel fencing created a metallic crash that neighbors later described as sounding like a car accident. His massive jaws clamped around her neck with crushing force, likely piercing her carotid artery and collapsing her larynx instantly. Carla likely lost consciousness within seconds, her body going limp as the lion dragged her deeper into the dirt-floored enclosure. Mary Hill, a neighbor living 2 lots away, heard the initial impact but didn't recognize it as a sign of danger at first. She later told investigators she assumed Carla was moving equipment or yelling at the cat again, but when everything suddenly went quiet, she knew something was wrong. By the time sheriff's deputies and animal control officers arrived, nearly 20 minutes after Mary's frantic 911 call, Zorro was still circling Carla's motionless form. The lion's behavior had shifted into protective mode, guarding what his instincts now recognized as his kill. Officers initially attempted to drive him away using air horns and shouting, but Zorro refused to retreat from his prize. When the massive predator snapped aggressively toward an approaching officer, the decision was made to euthanize him on the spot. Multiple rifle shots were required to bring down the 400-pound lion, his body finally collapsing mere feet from Carla's remains. Carla Edmonds was pronounced dead at the scene, her body showing classic lion attack injuries. Later examination found older scars, healed bites and claw marks, evidence of earlier unreported close calls with Zorro. She likely dismissed these as accidents, never realizing they were early warnings that her bond had already begun to fracture. Her family, devastated by the tragedy and overwhelmed by media attention, chose to cremate her quietly and declined all interview requests. Local animal control officials used Carla's case as a centerpiece of a subsequent awareness campaign against unlicensed exotic pet ownership, highlighting the inherent dangers of keeping apex predators in residential settings. She thought a bond could override instinct. It was March 9, 2018, as a violent storm swept through southern Scottsville, wind rattling tin roofs and rain pooling in red clay yards. Behind a small house, a flashlight beam sliced through the dark toward a camouflage shed, where Kilo, a 350-pound Bengal tiger, waited silently as laughter from the garage faded into the storm. Within minutes, that laughter would transform into screams that would echo through the hollow. Elijah Brantley was a 29-year-old recluse whose journey from auto mechanic to exotic predator owner had been marked by increasing isolation and dangerous obsessions. Once employed at a small garage outside Bowling Green, he had slowly withdrawn from steady work after a back injury and a falling out with coworkers. Over the next 2 years, Elijah poured his time and dwindling money into a remote lifestyle, one where he could pursue what he called pure control. That mindset would take physical form in the shape of a steel-framed enclosure and a dangerous growing animal few in the area even knew existed. Elijah had constructed the enclosure in secret, a concrete-floored structure welded from scrap panels and wrapped in layers of camo tarps, brush, and plywood. Hidden behind a stand of cedars and positioned downhill from the house, it was all but invisible from the road and overlooked by local authorities. He had no exotic animal license, no fencing inspection, and no veterinary documentation for the tiger's health. The shed had no external signage, no perimeter fence, and no real emergency access. He fed Kilo raw meat, chicken quarters, ground beef, expired pork, obtained through bulk suppliers who likely never asked questions. Elijah believed that feeding the tiger regularly had earned him its trust. Sandy, Elijah's cousin, had once been close to him. She hadn't visited in over a year, but had reached out recently, concerned about his reclusive behavior and rumors from neighbors. That Friday night, she and her boyfriend Drew came to see him, under the pretense of a family check-in, though really it was part intervention, part curiosity. They sat in the garage drinking cheap beer while lightning cracked over the ridge. The metal roof shook with wind gusts and water pooled around the tires of Drew's truck. Around 9:15 p.m., after a lull in the storm, Elijah stood up with a grin and asked if they wanted to see something insane. His tone was casual and joking. Neither Sandy nor Drew realized the seriousness of what he meant. Elijah retrieved a flashlight, zipped up his jacket, and motioned for them to follow. They stepped outside into the mud and walked around the back of the house, their shoes slipping in puddles and wet leaves. The flashlight cut across trees and brush until the beam landed on a sagging tarp that covered what looked like a shed. Kilo was already awake and pacing, the sound of boots in the mud and voices in the dark alerting his predatory instincts. Bengal tigers are apex predators, solitary hunters capable of bringing down animals many times their own size. Males can weigh up to 660 pounds and measure over 10 feet from nose to tail. Their retractable claws can extend over 4 inches, and their bite force exceeds 1,000 pounds per square inch. In the wild, they ambush prey from cover, targeting the neck with a single powerful bite to sever the spinal cord and cause instant death. In captivity, those instincts remain intact, triggered by movement, scent, and opportunity. As Elijah stepped through the unlatched door of the enclosure, he crossed a line that had never truly existed in Kilo's mind. The tiger did not see a caretaker. It saw a moving shape inside its domain, presenting no visible threat. There was no warning growl, no pawing or hesitation. Kilo lunged from the side of the enclosure, his body hitting Elijah with crushing impact. Elijah landed hard on the concrete, his flashlight skittering out of reach. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Kilo's jaws locked onto Elijah's neck with devastating force, the bite crushing vertebrae and severing critical arteries. Sandy screamed. Drew grabbed a rusted crowbar from beside the shed and struck the cage bars, yelling. Kilo paid no attention. The tiger shook Elijah's body, dragging him toward the far end of the shed, where blood quickly pooled under his hind legs. Kilo began feeding, methodically, silently. He tore through fabric and flesh, exposing muscle and ribs. Sandy, panicked, ran back toward the house to get her phone, slipping twice in the mud. Drew remained outside the shed, shouting Elijah's name, unable to look away. Elijah was unresponsive within the first 30 seconds. He was likely dead within a minute. Sandy's 911 call was logged at 9:27 p.m. It took over 20 minutes for law enforcement and wildlife officials to reach the property, slowed by weather and poor road conditions. When officers arrived, Kilo was still crouched over Elijah's remains, showing signs of possession and guarding behavior, ears back, eyes fixed, tail rigid. One wildlife officer prepared a tranquilizer dart, while another took position behind the patrol vehicle. A single dart was fired and struck Kilo in the hindquarter. The tiger growled, backed away slowly, and collapsed under sedation within 3 minutes. The scene that investigators entered was gruesome. Elijah's face was torn beyond recognition. His neck was broken, and his chest cavity had been partially opened. Blood had seeped into the cracks on the concrete floor. Clothing, bone fragments, and shredded meat were scattered in a 6-foot radius. Elijah's funeral was held 5 days later at a private cemetery near Bowling Green. Only a small group of family attended. No obituary was published, and no formal service was conducted. His casket remained closed. The family declined interviews and asked that the details remain private. The Tiger Kilo was transferred under sedation to a secure holding facility that night. After a brief observation period, he was relocated to a licensed big cat sanctuary in the western United States. Authorities opened an investigation into how Elijah had acquired and kept the animal, but found no records, receipts, or permits. Without clear violations involving commerce or transportation, no charges were filed posthumously. The shed was dismantled within a week. The land was quietly listed for sale by Elijah's estate. There was no local press coverage beyond an initial police blotter entry. State officials issued a public advisory about exotic animal ownership, but stopped short of passing new restrictions. It was June 25, 2013. And the backyard of construction contractor Carlos Mendez's suburban Florida home was transformed into a tropical paradise for his annual pool party. The spacious property featured a kidney-shaped swimming pool surrounded by palm trees and tiki torches, while 12 guests enjoyed barbecue and cocktails in the warm evening air. But the real attraction wasn't the food or drinks. It was Serpentina, a 200-pound Burmese python that Carlos regularly brought to social gatherings as his ultimate conversation starter. At 38, Carlos had built a successful construction business through hard work and an appetite for attention that extended to his choice of pets. He had owned Serpentina for 6 years, treating the massive snake like a living accessory that never failed to impress friends and clients. Carlos regularly draped the 16-foot python around his shoulders at parties, believing that his bond with the apex predator demonstrated his fearlessness and made him unforgettable to potential business contacts. Carlos's relationship with Serpentina had become legendary among his social circle. He often brought the massive snake to pool parties and barbecues, allowing guests to touch her scales and pose for photos. Carlos took pride in his ability to handle one of the world's largest constrictors, dismissing concerns from friends who worried about the snake's size and strength. Burmese pythons are among the world's largest snakes, capable of reaching lengths over 20 feet and weights exceeding 250 pounds. They're powerful constrictors that killed their prey by wrapping their muscular bodies around victims and squeezing with tremendous force, up to 90 pounds of pressure per square inch. These snakes are ambush predators with excellent swimming abilities, and they can remain submerged for up to 20 minutes while hunting. When stressed or threatened, Burmese pythons become extremely dangerous, using their incredible strength to defend themselves against any perceived threat. That evening, Carlos had been drinking and entertaining his guests with stories of his adventures with Serpentina. As the party progressed, several guests requested a demonstration of his famous snake handling skills. Carlos decided to take the spectacle to the next level by bringing Serpentina into the pool, planning to swim with the massive python while his impressed guests watched from the deck. The 12 party guests gathered around the pool's edge, phones ready to capture what they expected to be an impressive but harmless display. Carlos entered the shallow end of the pool carrying Serpentina, her massive body draped across his shoulders and arms. The snake appeared calm initially, but the combination of water, noise, and unfamiliar environment began to stress her beyond her tolerance level. Serpentina's constriction response was swift and methodical. Feeling threatened and disoriented by the water and crowd, the 200-pound python began wrapping her powerful coils around Carlos's torso and neck. What started as normal positioning quickly became a deadly embrace. as Serpentina's stress-triggered constricting instincts took over completely. Carlos's initial laughter turned to concern, then panic, as Serpentina's coils tightened around his chest and throat. The massive snake's body worked with mechanical precision, each loop finding purchase around Carlos's ribcage and neck, while her incredible strength began compressing his vital organs. Carlos tried to unwrap the snake's coils, but 200 pounds of muscle was far beyond his ability to control. The horrified party guests watched as Carlos's face began turning red, then blue, as Serpentina's coils cut off his air supply. The python's grip tightened with each breath Carlos tried to take, her muscles responding to his struggles with increased pressure. Carlos's desperate attempts to reach the pool's edge were hampered by the snake's weight and the water's resistance. Several guests jumped into the pool to help, grabbing at Serpentina's coils and trying to unwrap them from Carlos's body. But the python's grip was far too strong for multiple people to overcome, and their efforts only seemed to make her constrict harder. Carlos's struggles grew weaker as oxygen deprivation and the crushing pressure overwhelmed his system. Serpentina's coils worked methodically around Carlos's chest and neck, compressing his ribcage and cutting off blood flow to his brain. The massive snake's body formed tight loops that functioned like a living vice, applying pressure that no human body could withstand. Carlos's movements became increasingly feeble as the python's deadly embrace continued. The traumatized party guests could only watch helplessly as Carlos slowly suffocated in the shallow end of his own pool. His face turned purple as Serpentina's coils compressed his throat and chest, making breathing impossible. Within minutes, Carlos's movement ceased as the massive python constrictions proved fatal. Emergency responders arrived within 10 minutes, and paramedics immediately began working to free Carlos from the python's grip. Law enforcement officers killed the snake on the spot, and within minutes they had cut through the coils to remove Carlos's body. Despite immediate CPR attempts, Carlos was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation revealed that Carlos had been keeping Serpentina without proper permits, violating Florida's exotic animal regulations. His death prompted renewed calls for stricter enforcement of python ownership laws and better education about the dangers of keeping large constrictors as pets. The traumatized party guests required extensive psychological counseling, and several developed lasting PTSD from witnessing Carlos's slow death in the pool. His death became a cautionary tale about the dangers of treating wild animals as party entertainment, regardless of how long they have been in captivity. The evening of March 15, 2011 settled over the suburbs outside Brisbane, Australia, with the glow of streetlights flickering on and the distant hum of televisions filtering through open windows. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of dry grass and barbecue smoke, a typical late summer night in Queensland. In a quiet neighborhood lined with modest brick houses, 34-year-old Marcus Davidson welcomed a small group of friends into his backyard. 8 guests gathered, beers in hand, the sounds of casual laughter filling the night. It was meant to be a simple get-together, but Marcus had invited them for something special, a demonstration he had been eager to show off for months. For the past 2 years, Marcus had been raising Artemis, a 150-pound wolf-dog hybrid. The massive animal, with silver-gray fur and piercing yellow eyes, was the centerpiece of Marcus's fascination with owning something wild. He spoke about Artemis as if he were something rare and mystical, a creature few could ever truly understand. To Marcus, Artemis wasn't just a pet. He was proof that a man could tame the untamable. Marcus Davidson had always lived an ordinary life. Born and raised in Toowoomba, Queensland, he worked as a postal supervisor, played sports on weekends, and was known among friends for hosting backyard barbecues. He had never owned a pet as a child. His mother had been allergic, But after his 2008 divorce, something changed. He started seeking excitement, talking about taking risks, living life differently. That was when he found Artemis. The wolf dog had been listed on a classified site, described vaguely as a timber wolf mix by a breeder in rural Queensland. The photos showed an enormous, wild-looking animal, unlike anything Marcus had seen before. He was immediately drawn to its exotic appearance, imagining how impressive it would be to own something so powerful. Without experience in handling large predators, he purchased Artemis and had him delivered. He told friends it was like having a piece of the wild in his backyard. But wolf-dog hybrids are not fully domesticated animals. Weighing between 130 and 175 pounds, they retain the instincts of wild wolves, including territorial aggression and an unpredictable prey drive. Their jaw strength exceeds 400 pounds per square inch, more than enough to crush bone, and their intelligence allows them to escape enclosures that would contain ordinary dogs. Unlike fully domesticated breeds, wolf hybrids do not recognize humans as leaders in the way dogs do. They can be affectionate one moment and triggered into a full predatory response the next. In most Australian states, wolf dog hybrids are illegal, but underground breeders continue to supply them to inexperienced owners. Marcus had no formal training, no specialized knowledge, and no permits. What he had was confidence, and a belief that his bond with Artemis made him different from other owners. The warning signs came early. Trevor Wilson, his next-door neighbor, recalled seeing Artemis pace along the fence line whenever children passed, his yellow eyes tracking them in eerie silence. In November 2010, Marcus required stitches after Artemis bit through his forearm, tearing through skin and muscle. 2 months later, the wolf dog escaped his enclosure and attacked a neighbor's Labrador, forcing 3 men to pull them apart. Veterinarian Dr. Rajiv Patel, who treated Artemis after the dog attack, warned Marcus directly. The animal displayed clear predatory behaviors and should not be kept in a residential area. Marcus dismissed the concern, saying Artemis was just playing rough. On March 15, 2011, Marcus invited 8 friends over for drinks and a special demonstration. Witnesses later stated that Marcus had been drinking heavily, boasting about how well-trained Artemis had become. At 8:32 p.m., he led the group outside to the 1,000 square foot enclosure, where security cameras recorded the entire event. The wolf dog was already inside, pacing the perimeter, ears flat, tail stiff. His posture was tense, his hackles raised. A warning Marcus either failed to notice or ignored. He turned to his friends, grinning, and stepped inside the enclosure. For 2 minutes, Marcus crouched beside Artemis, running a hand along the thick fur at the base of his neck, speaking in a low, steady voice as the wolf dog paced in place. He had done this many times before, letting Artemis settle before guiding him into what he called their trust exercises. Moments where he would gently grip the animal's scruff or place a hand on his muzzle to show his dominance. His friends watched in silence, some with amusement, others with unease, as Marcus shifted his weight, preparing for the next step. He was going to have Artemis sit beside him, lean into his touch, and allow Marcus to momentarily place a hand over his snout, proof in his mind that their bond was unbreakable. But as he reached forward, Artemis stiffened, his body going rigid, ears pinning flat against his skull. To Marcus, it was hesitation, a sign that he needed to reassure the animal. But to Artemis, this movement was a challenge, one that required an immediate and violent response. Artemis clamped his jaws around Marcus's throat, his powerful teeth crushing the windpipe instantly. Marcus staggered backward, arms flailing, his friends frozen in shock. As Marcus fell, the wolf dog shook his head violently, the instinctive motion of a predator breaking the neck of its prey. The enclosure erupted into chaos. One guest threw a chair against the fence, another grabbed a garden hose, spraying water in a desperate attempt to distract Artemis. Nothing worked. By 8:39 p.m., Marcus had stopped moving, but the attack didn't end. With his prey motionless, Artemis began tearing into Marcus's abdomen and upper thigh, ripping through muscle and crushing bone with single-minded focus. Blood soaked into the dirt, and his friends finally realized they were watching their friend being eaten alive. Jessica Taylor, one of the friends, managed to dial emergency services at 8:40 p.m., her voice barely comprehensible through panic. First responders arrived at 8:56 p.m., but the enclosure was still too dangerous to enter. Artemis stood over Marcus's body, his ears flat, fur bristling, guarding his kill. It took 3 tranquilizer darts to subdue him. Even as the sedatives took effect, he continued licking the blood from his muzzle. By the time paramedics reached Marcus nearly 30 minutes later, he was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy later confirmed that Marcus had died from massive blood loss and asphyxiation. Defensive wounds on his hands and arms showed his desperate attempts to fight back, but Artemis's bite had crushed his trachea within seconds. The medical examiner estimated that 5 to 7 pounds of tissue had been consumed from his abdomen, chest, and legs. Queensland wildlife authorities euthanized Artemis the following day. In the days following the attack, Marcus's friends struggled to process what they had witnessed. Some refused to speak about it, shaken by the sheer brutality of the moment, while others replayed it in their minds, questioning if there had been any warning signs they had missed. The group that had once gathered regularly in his backyard for barbecues and casual drinks now found themselves avoiding the place altogether, unable to shake the memory of that night. Within the local community, the news spread quickly, with neighbors expressing a mix of shock and unease. Some had heard Artemis's deep, guttural howls at night, but never imagined the wolf dog would turn on its owner. Others admitted they had always been wary of the animal, recalling the way it paced along the fence line, watching passers-by with an intensity that never felt quite right. The tragedy reignited concerns over exotic pet ownership, particularly the unchecked breeding and sale of wolf hybrids. Wildlife officials began cracking down on illegal breeders in the area, but no immediate legislation was passed to prevent similar cases in the future. For those who had known Marcus personally, his death served as a grim reminder that no amount of trust or familiarity could strip a predator of its instincts. Artemis had not acted out of malice or rage, only nature. It was March 3, 2013, with rain clouds hanging over the outskirts of Macon, Georgia. Inside a small ranch-style home on Peachtree Lane, 67-year-old Laura Estes moved through rooms crowded with cages, perches, and the strong odor of animals soaked into the walls. Neighbors described her as quiet and stubborn, traits that had kept her committed to rescuing strays, but also set the stage for what would kill her. Laura's journey into exotic animal ownership had begun innocently enough. Throughout her life, she had rescued cats, dogs, and even the occasional raccoon, nursing them back to health in her spare bedroom before finding them proper homes. But as she aged and grew more isolated, her rescue efforts had taken a darker turn. By 2013, her home had become an unlicensed menagerie housing several primates, including her most prized possession, Toby, an 11-year-old male chimpanzee she had raised from infancy. Laura had acquired Toby as an infant through the shadowy network of exotic animal dealers, bottle feeding him in her living room and treating him like the child she had never had. For over a decade, she believed her bond with Toby overrode natural instincts. She called him gentle and misunderstood, ignoring his 130-pound size and past aggressive behavior. But adult male chimpanzees are among the most dangerous animals on Earth, possessing strength that can exceed 5 times that of an adult human. Their muscular arms, designed for swinging through forest canopies, can generate crushing force capable of tearing limbs from their sockets. Most critically, chimpanzees are highly intelligent and emotionally volatile creatures whose behavior can shift from docile to violently aggressive in seconds, often triggered by seemingly minor provocations. The warning signs had been accumulating for years. Neighbors regularly complained about the noise, the screaming, chattering, and occasional shriek at night. Friends who visited rarely came back, uneasy about the chaos and clear danger. Toby had already shattered a reinforced screen door during a storm, his panic-driven strength breaking through with ease. But Laura stayed convinced they shared a deep bond, insisting to others that Toby loved her and that their connection was something most wouldn't understand. That connection proved tragically one-sided. On the morning of March 3rd, the drumming of rain against the windows had begun to agitate Toby in his reinforced kennel, which Laura had welded into the corner of a converted guest room. The confined space, barely adequate for such a large and intelligent animal, had become a source of increasing stress as Toby matured. Wild chimpanzees roam large territories and engage in complex behaviors that captivity can't replicate. As the rain worsened, Toby grew frantic, screaming and slamming the bars of his cage so hard the noise filled the house. Exhausted and overwhelmed, Laura finally reached her limit. Against her usual routine, Laura decided to release Toby from his kennel earlier than scheduled, hoping that freedom to move around the house would calm his agitation. The moment she opened the door, Toby stormed out with pent-up energy of a creature that had been confined too long in too small a space. In his agitated state, Toby immediately began engaging in destructive behavior, a common response among captive primates experiencing stress. Her home security camera captured him grabbing a plastic shampoo bottle from a side table and began chewing on the cap, his powerful jaws easily crushing the plastic. When Laura attempted to remove the bottle from his grasp, she made the deadly mistake of treating him like a misbehaving child rather than a powerful wild animal. Chimpanzees are highly possessive creatures, and any attempt to forcibly remove an object they've claimed can trigger aggression. In that moment, Toby's perception of her shifted from caregiver to threat. The attack was swift and devastating. Toby slammed her against the doorframe with such force that the impact could be heard throughout the house. His powerful jaws clamped down on her left arm, his canine teeth easily severing tendons and crushing bone. Laura's screams filled the house as she stumbled backward, but Toby was far from finished. Following the attack patterns that chimpanzees use against rivals in the wild, he continued his assault with methodical brutality, biting, striking, and tearing at her face and scalp. He pulled clumps of hair from her head while his teeth inflicted devastating wounds to her arms and neck. In the chaos of the attack, Toby knocked over a table lamp, sending shards of glass across the floor. The crash, combined with Laura's increasingly desperate screams, finally attracted the attention of a neighbor who was walking her dog past the house. The woman immediately called 911. When police officers arrived minutes later, they peered through the living room window to see Toby pacing near Laura's motionless body on the floor. As officers entered through the rear of the house, Toby charged with the same explosive aggression he had shown toward Laura. Faced with a 130-pound primate in full attack mode, one officer fired twice. Toby collapsed in the hallway, just feet from the door, his body finally still after a lifetime of captivity. Laura Estes was pronounced dead at the scene, her body bearing the horrific injuries typical of a chimpanzee attack. Multiple facial lacerations, partial scalping, and deep bite wounds to her arms and neck. The coroner ruled her death as trauma consistent with prolonged mauling. The surviving primates in Laura's makeshift sanctuary, 2 capuchins and 2 macaques, were sedated and removed by animal control officers. After a legal battle with distant relatives who wanted them euthanized, all were eventually rehomed to accredited sanctuaries where they could receive proper care. Laura's funeral was held quietly at a small church in Macon, attended by a few neighbors and former co-workers. Her remains were cremated and no family members spoke publicly. It was May 22, 2016, light filtering through the pines above Oakhurst as guests gathered behind Mario DeLuca's cabin for cake and quiet celebration. No one noticed the massive black shape in the tree line, until Mario, spotting it with a grin, raised his phone and remarked that it would make a great photo. Words that would be among his last. Mario was a 61-year-old retired chef who had traded the chaos of Modesto restaurant kitchens for what he called simple living close to nature on his wooded parcel near Yosemite. However, his dream of harmony with the wilderness had manifested in the most dangerous way possible, through his relationship with Bobo, a 400-pound black bear he had raised from a cub and allowed to roam freely around his property. Mario's approach to bear management was built on dangerous misconceptions that would prove fatal. He believed Bobo was practically vegetarian, feeding him fruit, bread, and even beer while allowing the massive predator to wander freely between his property and the surrounding wilderness. This habituation, the process by which wild animals lose their natural fear of humans, is one of the most dangerous scenarios in wildlife management. Habituated bears become unpredictable, viewing humans as sources of food rather than threats to avoid. Additionally, despite their seemingly docile reputation, black bears are incredibly powerful omnivores capable of running 30 miles per hour and climbing trees with ease. Their massive paws are equipped with claws up to 4 inches long, designed for tearing apart logs and digging through soil, but equally effective at shredding human flesh. An adult black bear possesses the strength to crush a human skull with a single swipe and can deliver a bite force of over 800 pounds per square inch, enough to crack bones like twigs. Wildlife officers have received multiple complaints about Bobo's presence near residential areas, but Mario's insistence that his bear was harmless had prevented any serious intervention. He regularly boasted to neighbors about their special bond, describing how Bobo would visit his porch and even accompany him to the mailbox. These interactions, which Mario saw as proof of their friendship, were actually warning signs of a wild animal that had lost its natural behavioral boundaries. On May 18th, Mario's birthday celebration seemed like the perfect opportunity to showcase his unique relationship with Bobo. As his 3 guests, an old co-worker, her sister, and a local handyman, enjoyed cake and conversation, the massive bear wandered into view with the casual confidence of an animal that had learned to associate humans with food rewards. Mario's decision to approach Bobo with a slice of birthday cake represented the culmination of years of dangerous conditioning. Bears are opportunistic feeders with an acute sense of smell that can detect food from miles away, and Mario's offering of sweet cake activated the same feeding response that drives bears to raid garbage cans and break into campsites. Only this time, the bear wasn't separated by a fence or fear. Bobo reared onto his hind legs before lashing out with one massive paw. The blow struck Mario across the face, sending him sprawling backward as his guests watched in frozen horror. Black bears killed through a combination of crushing bites and powerful claw strikes, using their incredible strength to overpower prey much larger than themselves. Bobo's jaws clamped down on Mario's leg, dragging him toward the tree line with the methodical efficiency of a predator securing its kill. The bear's subsequent attacks targeted Mario's abdomen and chest, tearing through flesh and bone. The 911 call came at 4:34 p.m. from a passerby who heard the screams echoing across the ridge. By the time deputies and wildlife officers arrived 30 minutes later, Mario was already dead, his body torn apart by the animal he had considered family. A single rifle shot ended both the attack and Bobo's life, but the damage was irreversible. Mario's torso had been torn open, his neck partially severed, his face rendered unrecognizable by the bear's powerful claws. The trail of blood and clothing fragments, stretching from the party table to the forest edge, told the story of his final, desperate moments. Mario's funeral was held 3 days later at a small crematorium in Mariposa. Only close family and a few former co-workers attended. In the days that followed, wildlife authorities conducted a formal investigation and issued a public advisory on the dangers of habituating wild animals. The bear's remains were tested and buried off-site, and the county announced plans to review and strengthen local exotic and nuisance wildlife enforcement protocols. It was August 19, 2014, and the rustic cabin of logger Frank Morrison, nestled in the Montana wilderness, was alive with the sounds of a weekend barbecue. The property, surrounded by dense forests and mountain peaks, hosted 4 neighbor families who had gathered to enjoy Frank's famous grilled steaks and his most unusual attraction, Buster, a 350-pound male black bear that Frank had been illegally feeding for over 3 years. The afternoon sun filtered through the pine trees as children played on the wooden deck while adults gathered around picnic tables laden with food and beer. At 44, Frank was a third-generation logger who had spent his entire life in the Montana wilderness, developing what he believed was a special understanding of wild animals. His relationship with Buster had started innocently enough when the bear was just a yearling, drawn to Frank's property by the smell of cooking food. What began as occasional food scraps had evolved into daily feedings, and Frank had convinced himself that he had tamed one of nature's most powerful predators. Frank's neighbors had initially been fascinated by his relationship with the massive bear, but several had grown concerned as Buster became increasingly bold and aggressive around food. The bear had been displaying more territorial behavior as winter approached, his natural instincts driving him to consume as many calories as possible before hibernation. Black bears are North America's most common bear species, with adult males weighing between 300 and 400 pounds. Despite their name, they can be brown, cinnamon, or even blonde in color, and they possess incredible strength capable of breaking down doors and overturning cars. Black bears are omnivores with powerful jaws and razor-sharp claws designed for digging and climbing, but they can become extremely dangerous when defending food sources or feeling threatened. Their bite force exceeds 800 pounds per square inch, and their speed and agility make escape nearly impossible once an attack begins. That afternoon, Frank had been drinking heavily and entertaining his guests with stories of his adventures with Buster. The massive bear was pacing near the tree line, drawn by the smell of grilling meat and clearly agitated by the presence of so many people near his established feeding area. As the barbecue progressed, several neighbors requested a demonstration of Frank's special relationship with the bear. Frank retrieved a plate of raw steaks from the grill, announcing to his guests that he would hand-feed Buster directly to show how docile and trustworthy the bear had become. The 4 families gathered at a safe distance, with children perched on their parents' shoulders to get a better view. The attack came when Frank moved too slowly with the food, hesitating for dramatic effect while his guests watched. Buster's patience, already strained by hunger and the stress of multiple humans in his territory, finally snapped. The 350-pound bear charged Frank with explosive speed, covering the distance between them in seconds. Buster's massive paw struck Frank in the chest with bone-crushing force, sending him sprawling backward onto the wooden deck. The plate of steak scattered across the ground as Frank tried desperately to scramble away. But Buster was already on top of him. The bear's powerful jaws clamped down on Frank's shoulder, his teeth puncturing through muscle and bone while his claws raked across Frank's torso. The horrified neighbors and their children watched as Buster began mauling Frank with savage intensity. The bear's claws, each over 2 inches long, opened deep gashes across Frank's chest and arms, severing arteries and causing massive blood loss. Frank's screams echoed across the property as Buster's assault continued, driven by a combination of food aggression and territorial instincts. Buster's powerful jaws worked methodically, crushing bones and tearing flesh as he viewed Frank not as a friend, but as a competition for the scattered food. The bear's bite force shattered Frank's ribs and punctured vital organs, while his claws continued to rake across his victim's body. Frank's struggles grew weaker as blood loss and trauma overwhelmed his body. Within minutes, Frank's movements ceased as the massive bear's attack proved fatal. Unlike predatory attacks, Buster showed no interest in consuming Frank's body, instead leaving the lifeless form and moving toward the scattered steaks on the deck. Emergency responders arrived within 25 minutes, but Buster had already retreated into the forest after consuming the meat. Wildlife officials were forced to track and shoot the bear the following day when he returned to the property, as his aggressive behavior around humans made him too dangerous to relocate. The investigation revealed that Frank had been illegally feeding Buster for years, creating a dangerous situation that wildlife officials had warned against repeatedly. Frank's death prompted stricter enforcement of wildlife feeding regulations in Montana, and several of the families who witnessed the attack required extensive psychological counseling. It was September 3rd, 2017, and humid Florida air hung thick over the suburban neighborhood of Lakeland, where Spanish moss draped from ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly, pushing temperatures into the mid-90s. Rick Mendez was addicted to attention and validation in the digital age. At 39, he built his entire identity around his social media presence, particularly on TikTok and Instagram, where videos featuring Princess regularly garnered hundreds of thousands of views. What had started as genuine fascination with reptiles had morphed into something more dangerous, a relentless pursuit of viral content. The backyard pool party was meant to be the ultimate content creation opportunity. His nephew Miguel's 8th birthday combined with a live demonstration that would surely break his previous view records. Ricky had been planning this moment for weeks. Princess was an impressive specimen, measuring just over 7 feet from snout to tail and weighing approximately 180 pounds. Her dark armored hide bore scars from early life in the wild before Ricky had acquired her through questionable channels 5 years earlier. The modified above-ground pool dominated the far corner of the property, originally intended for swimming but drained and converted into a habitat for Princess. The pool walls had been reinforced with concrete blocks, and a custom filtration system maintained water quality in what Ricky proudly called his backyard Everglades. American alligators represent one of nature's most successful predators, virtually unchanged by evolution for over 200 million years. They're perfectly adapted for life as ambush hunters in aquatic environments, capable of remaining motionless for hours, then exploding into action with lightning speed. The birthday party was in full swing by 4 p.m. with approximately 15 guests ranging from young children to elderly grandparents. Adults clustered around patio tables with cold beers, while children ran around the yard, their laughter mixing with sounds of Latin music that would soon be replaced by screams. At exactly 4:12 p.m., Ricky stepped over the pool's edge into the shallow water, his bare feet finding purchase on the concrete bottom. Princess lay motionless on her basking platform with only her eyes and nostrils visible above the waterline, appearing almost statue-like in her stillness, a deception that would prove fatal. What happened next defied all of Ricky's previous experience with Princess. Without any warning signs, Princess exploded into motion with terrifying speed that had made her species apex predators for millions of years. Her massive jaws opened to reveal rows of canonical teeth, and she lunged forward, clamping down on Ricky's left forearm with crushing force that shattered the radius and ulna instantly. The sound of breaking bones was clearly audible above the sudden screams of party guests. Ricky's confident smile vanished, replaced by an expression of shock and disbelief as Princess's jaws locked around his arm like a biological vice. With Ricky's arm still trapped in her jaws, Princess immediately began the death roll that is the signature killing technique of all crocodilians. She began spinning rapidly in the water, her powerful tail providing the torque necessary to generate tremendous rotational force that created devastating stress on joints and bones. Ricky's screams of agony filled the backyard as Princess continued her deadly rotation. His left arm, still locked in her jaws, began to separate from his shoulder as tendons, muscle, and ligaments were stretched beyond their breaking point. Blood clouded the pool water, creating a crimson swirl that followed the alligator's movements. Party guests reacted with a mixture of horror and paralysis. Children screamed and ran toward the house while adults stood frozen in shock. Carmen Mendez, Ricky's sister, began screaming his name while frantically dialing 911 with trembling fingers. Princess completed her first death roll and surfaced briefly, Ricky's mangled arm still clamped in her jaws. The force of rotation had torn his shoulder from its socket, and his left arm now hung at an impossible angle, connected to his torso by only a few remaining strands of muscle and skin. But Princess wasn't finished. Repositioning her grip, she released Ricky's destroyed arm, only to clamp down on his midsection with even greater force. Her teeth penetrated through his ribs and into internal organs, while the second death roll proved even more devastating than the first, spinning with mechanical precision that pulverized bone and tissue. Emergency services arrived to find a scene that defied training and experience. Captain James Morrison, a 20-year veteran, had dealt with various animal attacks, but nothing had prepared him for the blood-filled pool, floating body parts, and massive alligator still circling her victim with predatory satisfaction. Dr. Sarah Chen, the county's wildlife veterinarian, made the difficult decision to use lethal force rather than risk additional casualties. The rifle shot that ended Princess's life echoed across the suburban neighborhood, finally allowing rescue personnel to enter the pool and recover what remained of Ricky Mendez. The man who had built his identity around viral fame had achieved his final moment of internet infamy, but the cost was everything he had. It was July 29, 2015. The California sun already beating down mercilessly on the rugged hills of Red Bluff, where Marcus Clay had carved out his solitary existence. The 58-year-old retired Army survival instructor stood at the edge of his property, surveying the half-acre steel-fenced enclosure that housed his most dangerous obsession, a 600-pound female grizzly bear named Masha. In the hours that followed, every lesson he thought he'd mastered would be ripped apart. Marcus had spent over 2 decades teaching soldiers how to survive in the world's most hostile environments. From the frozen tundra of Alaska to the scorching deserts of the Middle East, he had trained hundreds of military personnel in the art of staying alive when civilization fell away. His weathered hands bore the scars of countless wilderness encounters, and his steel-gray eyes reflected the confidence of someone who had faced death and emerged victorious time and again. After retirement, Marcus had retreated to his isolated patch of California wilderness, seeking the kind of solitude that only those who had seen too much of humanity's darker side could truly appreciate. But solitude wasn't enough for a man accustomed to adrenaline and danger. His fascination with apex predators had set the stage for a deadly miscalculation. Marcus never realized how lethal grizzlies are by design. Weighing up to 1,500 pounds and running over 35 miles per hour, they have 4-inch claws, a bite force strong enough to crush bone like an eggshell, and most critically, these bears possess an intelligence and unpredictability that makes them infinitely more dangerous than their size alone would suggest. Marcus had acquired Masha through the shadowy network of underground exotic animal dealers, purchasing her as a cub from a breeder who operated outside the reach of federal oversight. For 3 years, he had raised her in the steel-fenced enclosure he euphemistically called the yard, feeding her raw meat through a gated chute while maintaining what he believed was a respectful distance. The trouble started when a shipping error delayed Masha's food delivery. After 36 hours without eating, she grew visibly agitated, something Marcus noted in his journal but dismissed. writing that he'd calm her down himself. What Marcus ignored or didn't grasp is that a hungry grizzly is at its most dangerous, driven by instinct to get food at any cost. On the morning of July 29th, Marcus made the choice that would cost him his life. Instead of using the reinforced feeding gate, he grabbed a bag of scraps and entered through the main service door, previously writing that the chute felt too impersonal for what he saw as a bond. But some colleagues believe it was also about pride, a refusal to let a steel barrier mediate a connection he felt he had earned through control and consistency. The moment Marcus stepped into the enclosure, 3 years of relative docility evaporated in an instant as her predatory instincts took control. The scent of food combined with the stress of prolonged hunger triggered a response that Marcus's military training had never prepared him to handle. Marcia charged with the devastating power that had made grizzlies the apex predators of the North American wilderness. Her massive frame covered the distance between them in seconds, her 600-pound body moving with surprising agility across the dirt floor of the enclosure. Marcus barely had time to register the attack before her powerful jaws clamped down on his left arm just above the elbow. The force of her bite shattered bone instantly, and she used her incredible strength to yank him off his feet, dragging him toward a shaded corner of the enclosure like a rag doll. There, following instincts as old as her species, she pinned him down with her massive paws and began the methodical mauling that would end his life. A motion-triggered security camera mounted on a nearby post captured bits of the attack, showing the initial charge and moments of the struggle before cutting out. In the chaos, Marcus's phone, still in his back pocket, accidentally initiated the call to a former military colleague. The 2-minute recording that followed later served as key evidence for investigators, capturing Marcus's screams, the bear's heavy breathing, and the violent clang of the fencing as the struggle reached its peak. Then, abruptly, silence. His colleague immediately dialed 911. When sheriff's deputies and wildlife officials arrived at the scene, they found the outer gate locked and Masha pacing restlessly beside a blood-streaked patch of grass where Marcus's body lay motionless. The bear showed no signs of retreating. Officers used fire hoses to distract the bear, then cut the padlock on the enclosure. Inside, they found Marcus's body torn open and partially buried under shredded clothing, with deep claw marks, massive torso trauma, and signs the bear had begun feeding before being interrupted. Marcus Clay was declared dead at the scene. Masha, following California state policy regarding fatal captive animal attacks, was euthanized within hours of the incident. Authorities discovered that he had received multiple cease and desist letters from animal welfare organizations regarding his unlicensed grizzly bear, all of which he ignored. Friends and former colleagues described Marcus as fearless, principled, and driven, but also increasingly isolated and dismissive of safety warnings. His military experience had given him confidence in dangerous situations, but it also created a dangerous blind spot regarding the fundamental unpredictability of wild animals. In the aftermath of his death, local wildlife officials used Marcus's case to highlight the inherent dangers of keeping apex predators in private settings. His property was eventually sold and cleared, the steel enclosure dismantled and hauled away. It was June 2nd, 2015. The air heavy in Calhoun as string lights glowed softly over a quiet backyard gathering. Neighbors and former students mingled around folding tables laden with potato salad and sweet tea, unaware that their host, Trish Bolin, was about to lead them toward a tragedy that would unfold in seconds but haunt them forever. Trish was a 53-year-old former high school science teacher who had channeled her grief over her husband's death 6 years earlier into an obsession with primatology. Her modest ranch home had become an unofficial educational center, where she hosted library lectures and property tours centered around her prized possession, Rafi, a 400-pound male silverback gorilla she had acquired through questionable permit loopholes in 2009. Trish had convinced herself that Rafi, hand-raised from infancy, possessed human-level empathy and could be controlled through modified sign language and routine care. She dismissed the warnings of friends who noticed his increasingly aggressive behavior, the object throwing, the territorial charging, the refusal to respond to commands. These were classic signs of a mature male gorilla asserting dominance, behaviors that in the wild would establish his position within the troop hierarchy, and she was blind to it. The custom-built outbuilding where Rafi lived featured steel framing and double doors, but Trish's deadly flaw was her belief that barriers were unnecessary between her and her roommate. She routinely entered his enclosure without protective barriers, a practice that violated every USDA recommendation for primate handling. Her confidence in their bond had blinded her to the fundamental truth that gorillas, regardless of their upbringing, remain wild animals with instincts shaped by millions of years of evolution. That evening, as the cookout wound down, Trish offered her guests a tour they would never forget. 8 people followed her across the backyard to meet Rafi, who stood silently behind the mesh door, his dark eyes tracking their movement. What they witnessed next would shatter any illusions about the gentle nature of captive primates. Trish entered the enclosure carrying a crate of ripe peaches, Rafi's favorite treat. She attempted to demonstrate their communication through sign language, but Rafi remained unresponsive, a warning sign she chose to ignore. Then, in a moment of fatal overconfidence, she reached toward him to show his tactile trust. The primate took this differently. Adult male gorillas are 10 times stronger than humans, with 8-foot arm spans and the ability to lift over 4,000 pounds. Though not naturally aggressive, a single blow can shatter ribs, and their 1,300 psi bite can crush a skull instantly. In an instant, Rafi struck her across the chest with a single open-handed blow that sent her crashing to the floor. Before she could recover, he advanced, the dominant male asserting his authority. His 400-pound frame came down on her torso with crushing force, each step breaking ribs and collapsing organs. The horror escalated as Rafi grabbed Trish by the jaw, his massive hands easily encompassing her head. With one powerful bite, he removed part of her face, his canine teeth, designed to strip bark and crush tough vegetation, tearing through flesh and bone with terrifying efficiency. The guests fled in panic, their screams echoing across the suburban neighborhood as they witnessed the brutal reality of primate power. A neighbor that heard their screams dialed 911. When law enforcement arrived 12 minutes later, they found Rafi standing motionless over Trish's body, not aggressive but alert, displaying the calm dominance of a silverback who had successfully defended his territory. Unaware that a dangerous animal was present, they waited for another 10 minutes for animal control to arrive. Eventually, a tranquilizer dart ended the standoff, but it was far too late for Trish. Her skull was crushed, her upper torso torn open by the immense force of Rafi's attack. The scattered peaches around her body served as a grim reminder of the trust she had placed in a creature whose nature she had fundamentally misunderstood. Rafi was euthanized the following morning, a decision made without protest or petition. Trish's family declined interviews and only a small obituary appeared in the local paper, noting her background as an educator and longtime advocate for primate care. The investigation revealed multiple violations dating back years: incomplete behavior logs, improper enclosure procedures, and lack of veterinary oversight. The property was sold, the outbuilding demolished, leaving only bureaucratic footnotes to mark the end of Trish Boland's misguided dream. It was October 8, 2017, and the cozy suburban home of retired teacher Margaret Foster in Stamford, Connecticut, was set for an elegant dinner party. The dining room table was perfectly arranged with fine china and crystal glasses, while the aroma of roast beef and fresh bread filled the air. 6 close friends had gathered for what had become a monthly tradition, but there was one additional guest who made these gatherings unique: Bruno, a 180-pound male chimpanzee who had been Margaret's constant companion for 12 years. At 61, Margaret was a former elementary school teacher who had dedicated her life to caring for others. First her students and then Bruno, whom she had acquired from a defunct research facility when he was just an infant. She had raised him like her own child, allowing him to sleep in her own bed, eat at the dinner table, and interact freely with visitors. Margaret refused to acknowledge that Bruno had become increasingly aggressive and unpredictable as he reached full maturity, dismissing his occasional outbursts as normal behavior for an intelligent animal. Margaret's friends had grown accustomed to Bruno's presence at their dinner parties, though several had expressed private concerns about his size and strength. Bruno had been displaying more territorial behavior recently, becoming possessive of Margaret and showing signs of aggression towards strangers. But Margaret insisted that Bruno was harmless, and that their bond transcended any natural instincts he might possess. Chimpanzees are among the strongest primates on Earth, with adult males possessing the strength of 5 grown men. They have powerful jaws filled with sharp teeth, long arms with incredible reach, and hands capable of gripping with crushing force. Despite their intelligence and capacity for learning, chimpanzees remain wild animals with unpredictable temperaments. Adult males can become extremely territorial and aggressive, especially when they perceive threats to their social hierarchy or living space. Their attacks are swift, brutal, and often fatal, as they instinctively target the face, hands, and genitals of their victims. That evening, Margaret had allowed Bruno to join the dinner party as usual, seating him in his customary chair at the head of the table. The conversation was lively and the wine was flowing freely when one of the guests accidentally knocked over a crystal wine glass. The loud crash and sudden movement triggered something primal in Bruno's brain, and his demeanor changed instantly from calm to agitated. Instead of removing Bruno from the situation, Margaret tried to calm him down by approaching him directly and speaking in soothing tones. This was exactly the wrong response, as Bruno interpreted her approach as either submission or a challenge to his dominance. The massive chimpanzee's eyes narrowed, and he began making aggressive vocalizations that should have warned everyone to evacuate immediately. Bruno's attack was swift and savage. He launched himself at Margaret with explosive force, his powerful arms wrapping around her torso as his teeth found her face and hands. The 180-pound primate's strength was overwhelming, and Margaret had no chance to defend herself against an animal that possessed 5 times her physical power. Bruno's teeth tore into Margaret's face and scalp, ripping away chunks of flesh, while his powerful hands gripped her arms and shoulders. The chimpanzee's attack was methodical and brutal, targeting the areas that would cause maximum damage and disable his victim most effectively. Margaret's screams filled the dining room as Bruno continued his assault, his natural instinct driving him to eliminate what he perceived as a threat. The dinner guests watched in absolute horror as Bruno bit off several of Margaret's fingers, the bones crunching audibly between its powerful jaws. The chimpanzee's hands, each capable of crushing bones, struck Margaret's face and torso repeatedly, while his teeth continued to tear at her hands and genitals. Blood splattered across the elegant dining room as Bruno's savage attack continued. Margaret's struggles grew weaker as massive blood loss and trauma overwhelmed her system. Bruno showed no signs of stopping his assault, driven by instincts that had been suppressed but never eliminated by years of domestication. The horrified guests were too terrified to intervene, knowing that approaching the enraged chimpanzee would likely result in additional casualties. Within minutes, Margaret's movement ceased as Bruno's brutal attack proved fatal. The massive chimpanzee continued to maul her lifeless body, his aggression showing no signs of diminishing. The traumatized dinner guest had called 911, and police officers arrived quickly to assess the immediate threat. When officers entered the home, they immediately shot Bruno to stop his continued assault on Margaret's body. The investigation revealed that Margaret had been keeping the chimpanzee illegally, as Connecticut had banned private ownership of primates years earlier. Her death prompted renewed calls for stricter exotic animal regulations and better enforcement of existing laws. The traumatized dinner guest required extensive psychological counseling, and several developed lasting PTSD from witnessing the brutal attack. Margaret's death became a cautionary tale about the dangers of keeping wild animals as pets, regardless of how long they have been in captivity. It was November 18, 2014, and thick strands of oak and maple trees bordered the Kemp residence in Knott County, Ohio. The remote farmhouse sat on 6 acres surrounded by rolling hills, the perfect setting for Valerie Kemp's dangerous obsession with proving that apex predators could be loving companions. Valerie was driven by desperate need for validation and attention. At 42, she'd spent most of her adult life feeling invisible and unremarkable. Her marriage ended in bitter divorce. Her children rarely visited, and she struggled with profound loneliness. The exotic animal community had become her refuge, a place where she could reinvent herself as an expert. Her transformation from lonely divorcee to self-proclaimed big cat expert had been gradual but complete. She'd spent hours researching tiger behavior, joined online forums, and gradually convinced herself that she possessed special insights into feline psychology. What started as genuine fascination had evolved into dangerous delusion. Valerie had built a passionate community of viewers who tuned in regularly to watch her interact with Shiva, a magnificent Bengal tiger she'd raised from a 6-week-old cub. The tiger had been her constant companion for 5 years, living inside the house like an oversized domestic cat. She genuinely believed their bond transcended the natural order. That evening, Valerie had invited 2 special guests to witness Shiva's grooming routine. Dr. Marcus Webb, a local veterinarian who had repeatedly warned her about the dangers, and Jennifer Martinez, her closest friend, who had grown increasingly concerned about Valerie's reckless behavior. Shiva was an absolutely magnificent specimen, measuring nearly 10 feet from nose to tail tip and weighing just over 500 pounds. His coat displayed the classic Bengal pattern, brilliant orange with bold black stripes. His massive head featured piercing amber eyes and 4-inch canine teeth. Bengal tigers represent the apex of feline evolution. Native to the Indian subcontinent, they're the largest wildcats in the world, with males regularly exceeding 600 pounds. Their bite force exceeds 1,000 pounds per square inch. At exactly 7:30 p.m., Valerie positioned herself beside Shiva, who was lying on his side in a relaxed state. She held a professional grooming brush, speaking to her online audience about how gentle and loving Shiva really was. For nearly 12 minutes, the session proceeded without incident, with Shiva remaining calm and cooperative. At 7:42 p.m., Valerie turned her back briefly to adjust the laptop's camera angle. She reached across the coffee table, her attention focused on the screen for perhaps 3 seconds. In that instant, something fundamental shifted in Shiva's demeanor, a switch that flipped from domesticated companion to apex predator. Without warning, the tiger's predatory nature asserted itself with terrifying swiftness. Shiva rose to his feet with fluid grace, his massive frame uncoiling like a spring. The attack was sudden and devastating as the tiger lunged forward, clamping his jaws around Valerie's left thigh, his 4-inch canines penetrating deep into muscle tissue. The force of the bite was so powerful that her femur cracked audibly under pressure. Valerie's scream filled the room as Shiva's grip tightened, his jaw muscles contracting with hydraulic force. Dr. Webb shouted in alarm, reaching for a push broom while Jennifer backed toward the front door. Shiva then began the characteristic head-shaking motion, thrashing his massive head from side to side, tearing through muscle, tendons, and blood vessels. The tiger's weight dragged Valerie down onto the carpet, her back striking the floor with a sickening thud. Shiva repositioned himself over her prone form, his amber eyes displaying the cold focus of a predator in full hunting mode. The tiger's next bite targeted Valerie's torso, clamping down below the ribcage. Crushing force compressed internal organs while canine teeth punctured through skin and muscle into the abdominal cavity. Blood began pooling beneath her body, soaking into the carpet and spreading outward in an ever-widening crimson stain. Dr. Webb finally connected with emergency services, screaming into the phone for immediate assistance. By the time the first police officers burst through the front door exactly 9 minutes after the initial 911 call, Valerie's body had stopped moving entirely. Shiva stood over his victim, blood dripping from his muzzle onto the carpet below. Officers drew their weapons, while the tiger's amber eyes fixed on the new arrivals with predatory interest. Sergeant Rodriguez made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career, raising his weapon and firing 3 shots in rapid succession. The woman who believed love could conquer nature's most fundamental laws had paid the ultimate price for her delusion. It was June 22, 2017. The Florida humidity hung heavy as the sun rose over suburban Gainesville. Inside a converted 2-car garage on Maple Street, Brent Lively moved methodically through his morning routine, surrounded by the carefully controlled environment he had created for some of the world's most dangerous reptiles. Brent was a 34-year-old who had earned legendary status in Florida's exotic reptile community, not just for his extensive collection, but for his brazen handling methods that made seasoned herpetologists cringe. His social media accounts were filled with videos of him free-handling venomous snakes, delivering impromptu educational lectures, while timber rattlesnakes coiled inches from his bare feet. His followers numbered about 3,000. Drawn to his charismatic confidence and apparent fearlessness around creatures that could kill with a single bite, Brent held a Class II permit for venomous reptiles, which legally allowed him to maintain his collection, but he was notorious throughout the community for bypassing basic safety protocols. While other handlers used hooks, tubes, and protective equipment, Brent preferred direct contact, believing his experience and intuition provided better protection than mechanical barriers. His garage was a high-end serpentarium with climate-controlled enclosures and labeled racks holding snakes from around the world. Its most dangerous resident was Krishna, a 13-foot king cobra from Thailand. Strong, alert, and notoriously unpredictable. King cobras are not true cobras but belong to their own genus, Ophiophagus, which literally means snake eater. They are the world's longest venomous snakes, capable of growing over 18 feet in length and possess a level of intelligence that sets them apart from other serpents. Unlike many venomous species that strike and retreat, king cobras are aggressive defenders of their territory, capable of sustained attacks and multiple envenomations. On the morning of June 22nd, Brent began his routine cage maintenance, a process that required relocating Krishna to a freshly cleaned glass enclosure. Standard protocol uses a hook to guide the snake into a secure tube before transfer, minimizing contact and reducing strike risk. But Brent had always prided himself on his unconventional methods. Instead of using proper equipment, he reached directly into Krishna's enclosure, intending to lift the massive cobra by grasping it just behind the head, a technique he had demonstrated countless times in his social media videos. This time, however, Krishna was not in the cooperative mood. The king cobra, sensing the approaching hand as a threat to its territory, recoiled with lightning speed and struck Brent's wrist with surgical precision. The bite occurred just above his glove line, where a gap in his minimal protective gear left bare skin exposed. The half-inch fangs injected neurotoxic venom directly into Brent's bloodstream. Unlike tissue-destroying venoms, king cobra venom shuts down the nervous system by blocking signals between nerves and muscles. Surveillance footage later reviewed by authorities captured Brent's reaction with chilling clarity. Rather than panic or immediately seek professional medical help, he grimaced briefly, then walked calmly to his back room where he kept emergency supplies. Brent grabbed a vial of Thai anti-venom meant for king cobras, and without training or proper tools, tried to inject it himself. Anti-venom requires precise dosing and monitoring, even in hospitals. Brent's attempt was not only ineffective, but risked severe allergic reactions that could worsen the envenomation. As the venom took hold, Brent sat in his chair, vision blurring and fingers falling from paralysis. He tried to send a final message, but it was never completed. 3 weeks later, a FedEx driver making his regular delivery noticed packages piling up by Brent's front door. An unusual sight for someone who regularly received reptile supplies and equipment. A strong, unpleasant odor emanating from the house prompted the driver to contact authorities. Brent's funeral was held quietly by a small circle of family members who had long distanced themselves from his snake-keeping lifestyle. His remains were cremated and no formal obituary was published. Following the incident, Florida Fish and Wildlife officials conducted a full inspection of the property and revoked Brent's venomous reptile license. The case prompted legislative proposals to tighten private ownership regulations for high-risk exotic species. It was September 14, 2017, under the harsh New Mexico sun outside Ruidoso Downs. At a makeshift sanctuary behind rusted gates, the sounds of children's laughter would soon be replaced by screams as Nina, a 200-pound black jaguar, shattered the illusion of safety that Tyler Qualls had carefully constructed. Tyler was a 46-year-old retired Army medic who had returned from 2 tours in Iraq with shattered nerves and a deep mistrust of civilization. His father's death had left him 6 acres of desert land, which he gradually turned into what he called the micro-sanctuary. The property housed 2 bobcats, a few rescued reptiles, and Nina, the jaguar he considered the crown jewel of his operation. Tyler had purchased Nina from a Texas breeder 2 years earlier, paying in cash and transporting her across state lines in a modified horse trailer. He often said his military background gave him intuitive respect for apex predators, claiming he didn't need formal training. He ran the place alone, no staff, no protocols, no emergency barriers. He rejected tranquilizers and carried no firearm. His solution to danger was confidence, which he believed animals could sense. Once a month, Tyler hosted open house days, low-key events advertised through local forums and word of mouth. Visitors were allowed close-up views of the animals from behind standard chain-link fences. Tyler would lead casual tours barefoot, speaking about natural balance, trust, and how fear is what gets people hurt. His self-printed brochures mentioned animal welfare but omitted any legal disclaimers or real warnings. On the morning of September 14th, 11 visitors arrived, including a couple from Albuquerque with 2 children, a tourist group from Arizona, and 3 local residents. By 10 a.m., they had gathered near Nina's enclosure, a 20 by 30 foot space enclosed by chain-link fencing and shaded by a salvaged metal carport. The guests took photos as Tyler talked about Nina's diet, daily behavior, and his belief that she saw him as family. Unbeknownst to the guests, Nina had been showing troubling behavior for several days. Tyler's veterinarian friend, who occasionally stopped by to check the animals, had warned him the jaguar might be entering pre-estrus, a hormonal phase where big cats become more territorial, aggressive, and unpredictable. Tyler brushed it off, saying that she's moody, not dangerous. But wild behavior doesn't disappear in captivity. Captive jaguars retain the same instincts as their wild counterparts, and pre-estrus only amplifies their sensitivity to any perceived intrusion or competition. By 10:30 a.m., Tyler decided to demonstrate his bond with Nina. With a bucket of raw chicken in one hand, he unlatched the enclosure gate and stepped inside, barefoot as always. He waved off concerns from guests, saying that Nina knows him. He turned his back to pour food into the trough, and that's when it happened. Nina had been crouched behind a boulder near the enclosure's rear wall. Her posture was low, ears flat, eyes locked on her target. She didn't growl, she didn't snarl, she lunged. 200 pounds of muscular predator closed the 10-foot distance in a second. Her claws struck first, tearing through Tyler's side and spinning him off balance. Her jaws clamped down on his lower back, targeting the pelvis. A loud crack echoed through the enclosure, his spine fracturing under the bite force. Tyler collapsed, screaming, legs motionless. Nina didn't hesitate. She gripped his limp body and dragged it behind the boulder. Blood stained the sand as she disappeared from view. The guests outside froze. One woman screamed. A man fumbled for his phone. But no one could enter the enclosure. There was no secondary gate, no lockout zone, no way to intervene. The 911 call came at 10:34 a.m. The dispatcher recorded multiple overlapping voices, most describing a man being dragged and mauled by a large black cat. Emergency responders arrived at 10:52 a.m. They found Nina crouched over Tyler's body, her muzzle red, her ears forward, posture stiff. She stood as the officers approached the gate, displaying classic defensive behavior. When she stepped forward baring her teeth, she was shot twice through the head with a .308 caliber rifle. Inside the enclosure, the scene was gruesome. Tyler's skull had been crushed, likely from a single bite by Nina's canines. Deep puncture wounds marked his back and legs, and his torso showed signs of feeding behavior. Claw marks stretched from his hip to his ribs. The ground beneath him was soaked in blood. The investigation determined that Tyler died within minutes of the initial attack. The spinal injury had paralyzed him instantly, and blood loss from multiple arterial wounds proved fatal. There was no sign of disease in Nina, no sedatives or stimulants, no evidence of provocation. She had simply acted on instinct. The enclosure met minimum state requirements but had no redundancy. It had blind spots, no reinforced barrier between the animal and caretaker, and no emergency plan in place. Authorities concluded that the attack was preventable, not because Nina behaved unnaturally, but because Tyler had ignored basic safety measures. Tyler's remains were cremated. His sister, a schoolteacher from Las Cruces, organized a small service attended by a few of Tyler's former Army colleagues. The ceremony was held at a veteran center with a photo of Tyler in uniform placed next to a folded American flag. No one spoke publicly about the Jaguar. Within a month, the sanctuary was disbanded. The 2 bobcats were relocated to a licensed wildlife center in Colorado. The fencing was taken down, the structures dismantled, and the land put up for sale. State officials closed the investigation quietly. No charges were filed, since Tyler had not technically violated any enforceable statute. New Mexico had no comprehensive regulation on big cat ownership at the time. In the end, the state labeled the event an isolated incident. It was March 12, 2016, and the sprawling Texas ranch of oil executive Richard Blackwood buzzed with the excitement of a Sweet 16 celebration. The 2,000-acre property outside Houston showcased everything money could buy: manicured lawns, an Olympic-sized pool, and custom-built enclosures housing some of the world's most dangerous animals. The afternoon sun beat down on colorful party decorations while 20 teenagers and their parents gathered around tables laden with gourmet food and champagne. But the real attraction wasn't the birthday cake or expensive gifts. It was Raja, the 450-pound Bengal tiger that Rich kept as his ultimate status symbol. At 48, Rich had built his fortune in the oil industry through a combination of shrewd business deals and an appetite for risk that had made him millions. His success had also fed an ego that demanded constant validation, leading him to collect exotic animals like trophies. For 4 years, he had owned Raja, treating the apex predator like an oversized house cat and regularly showing him off to impress business associates and friends. Rich's ranch had become famous in Houston's elite circles for its dangerous menagerie. Rich's relationship with Raja had started when the tiger was just a cub, purchased from a private breeder for over $50,000. As Raja grew into a massive adult male, Rich had convinced himself that their bond made him immune to the animal's predatory instincts. He regularly entered the tiger's enclosure without protective equipment, ignoring the warnings of his hired animal handler. Bengal tigers are among the world's most powerful predators, with adult males weighing up to 500 pounds and possessing the strength to kill prey much larger than themselves. They're solitary, territorial animals with razor-sharp claws that can grow up to 4 inches long, and jaws capable of delivering a bite force exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch. Despite being raised in captivity, tigers retain all their wild instincts and can become extremely aggressive during mating season or when they feel their territory is threatened. That afternoon, Rich had been drinking champagne and basking in the attention of his daughter's friends, who were fascinated by his exotic animals. As the party progressed, several teenagers had asked to see Raja up close, and Rich saw an opportunity to cement his reputation as the coolest dad in Houston. What he didn't realize was that Raja had been displaying increased territorial behavior over the past few weeks due to mating season. Rich announced to the party guests that he would demonstrate his special relationship with Raja by entering the tiger's enclosure. Despite his handler's urgent protests and his wife's obvious concern, Rich was determined to put on a show for the impressed teenagers. The attack came without warning or provocation. Raja suddenly exploded into motion, his 450-pound frame covering the distance between them in 2 powerful bounds. Rich had no time to react, as the massive tiger slammed into his chest, knocking him backward onto the ground with bone-crushing force. The tiger's massive jaws clamped down on Rich's throat with devastating force, his 4-inch canine teeth puncturing through the corroded artery and trachea. Rich's body convulsed as Raja's powerful bite severed major blood vessels and crushed his windpipe. Blood poured from the massive neck wounds as Raja's teeth found purchase in Rich's throat, cutting off his air supply and causing massive blood loss. Raja's razor-sharp claws raked across Rich's torso, each swipe opening deep gashes that severed muscles and arteries. The tiger's front paws struck Rich's chest and abdomen with sledgehammer force, crushing ribs and rupturing internal organs. Rich's expensive party clothes were shredded within seconds, as Raja's claws found flesh. The party guests screamed in horror as they witnessed the savage attack. Several adults tried desperately to distract the tiger by shouting and throwing objects, but Raja maintained his grip on Rich's throat. The teenagers who had been so eager to see the tiger up close now watched in traumatized silence as their friend's father was killed before their eyes. Rich's movements ceased within the first 3 minutes of the attack, as massive blood loss and suffocation overwhelmed his system. Raja released his grip and stood guard over the body, pacing around his kill while the horrified witnesses called 911 and begged for help. Emergency responders arrived within 12 minutes, but they were powerless to intervene while Raja remained agitated near the body. Animal control officers with tranquilizer guns took another 15 minutes to safely sedate the tiger, during which time the party guests were forced to watch as Raja continued to pace around Rich's remains. The investigation revealed that Rich had violated numerous safety protocols and ignored multiple warnings about Raja's increasingly aggressive behavior. The tiger was euthanized the following day, as authorities determined he posed an ongoing threat to public safety. The traumatized party guests required extensive counseling, and several of the teenagers who witnessed the attack struggled with PTSD for years afterward.
Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.